Have you ever wondered what a jury remembers most during a murder trial? Is it the photographs, the forensic evidence, or could it be a single desperate phone call made in the worst moment of someone's life? Inside a Massachusetts courtroom, jurors had already seen disturbing crime scene photographs. They had listened to hours of testimony from investigators. They had examined physical evidence collected from the Clancy family home. But according to courtroom reporters, nothing affected the room more than the moment Patrick Clancy's 911 call was played. Some veteran journalists later described it as one of the most heartbreaking recordings they had ever heard inside a courtroom. The recording was so emotional that the judge prohibited the public release of the full audio. While jurors were allowed to hear it as evidence, television viewers and the public were not. That decision immediately raised an important question. What made this phone call so powerful? And why could it become one of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire trial? To understand that, we have to go back to the afternoon of January 24th, 2023. Patrick Clancy had left his home after his wife, Lindsay Clancy, asked him to pick up takeout food from a nearby restaurant. According to testimony presented in court, nothing about the request seemed unusual. He left the house believing his wife would stay home with their 3 young children. Just a short time later, everything changed forever. When Patrick returned home, he noticed something immediately. The house felt strangely quiet. It was not the normal silence of children taking a nap. It was something different. Something felt terribly wrong. He walked through the house, calling for his family. There was no answer. As he reached the bedroom, he saw blood, not just a few drops. According to his testimony, blood appeared to be sprayed across multiple surfaces inside the room. He described seeing a large pool of blood on the floor. Investigators later confirmed that this bedroom became one of the most important crime scenes in the case. Patrick then discovered Lindsay seriously injured after what prosecutors say was an attempted suicide. But even at that moment, another terrifying question entered his mind. Where were the children? He began searching through the house. Seconds later, he made the phone call that jurors would eventually hear more than 3 years later during the trial. That call captured something no witness could ever recreate: raw human emotion. There were no prepared statements, no attorneys, no investigators asking questions, only a father trying to understand the unimaginable. Prosecutors waited until Patrick completed his testimony before playing the recording for the jury. That timing was no accident. They wanted jurors to first hear Patrick calmly describe what happened. Then they wanted them to experience what he sounded like while it was actually happening. The difference between those two moments may become one of the most powerful emotional contrasts presented during the entire trial. And according to reporters sitting inside the courtroom, the atmosphere changed immediately once the recording began. In part 2, we examine exactly how the jury reacted, why the courtroom became completely silent, and why experienced reporters say they had never witnessed evidence like this before. As soon as the recording began, the atmosphere inside the courtroom changed. For days, jurors had listened to testimony from police officers, forensic experts, and investigators. They had examined photographs, physical evidence, and timelines that carefully reconstructed the events inside the Clancy home. But this was different. This was not a witness remembering what happened years later. This was a husband living through the worst moment of his life in real time. The courtroom became completely silent. According to reporters who were present, every person in the room focused on the recording. No one moved. No one spoke. The only voice filling the courtroom was Patrick Clancy's desperate plea for help. Although the judge ruled that the recording would not be released publicly, journalists who heard it described it as one of the most emotionally devastating pieces of evidence they had ever experienced. Several veteran court reporters later said they had covered murder trials for years, yet few recordings had affected them as deeply as this one. The jurors' reactions were equally striking. There were originally 18 jurors seated in the courtroom, 12 women and 6 men, before the panel would eventually be reduced to the final 12. Court observers said several jurors appeared visibly emotional. Some lowered their heads, others fought back tears. Despite the emotional weight of the evidence, they remained attentive throughout the entire recording. One courtroom reporter later described their reaction with a single word: they endured it. That observation may seem simple, but it reveals something important. Jurors are instructed to evaluate evidence objectively. They cannot allow sympathy, anger, or emotion alone to determine their verdict. Yet they are also human beings. When evidence captures genuine human suffering, it can leave a lasting impression that no photograph or written report can match. Prosecutors clearly understood that. Rather than opening the trial with the recording, They waited until Patrick had already described the crime scene in detail. The jury first heard him explain what he saw when he entered the bedroom. He described blood covering multiple surfaces and a large pool of blood on the floor. Only after that testimony did prosecutors play the 911 call. By presenting the evidence in that order, they connected Patrick's calm courtroom testimony with the raw emotion he experienced on the day of the tragedy. The contrast was impossible to ignore. One version came from a witness recalling events more than 3 years later. The other came from a father confronting unimaginable horror as it unfolded. For prosecutors, the recording serves another purpose. It helps establish the timeline of events. A 911 call is created before investigators arrive, before lawyers become involved, before anyone has time to shape a narrative. Because of that, juries often view emergency calls as highly credible evidence. The defense, however, faces a different challenge. They cannot erase the emotional impact of the recording. Instead, they must persuade jurors to look beyond the heartbreaking circumstances and focus on Lindsay Clancy's mental condition at the time of the killings. That strategy became much clearer later in the trial. During cross-examination, Patrick was asked not only about what happened on the day of the tragedy, but also about Lindsay's behavior in the weeks leading up to it. Those questions would shift the trial away from the crime scene itself and toward the central issue that could ultimately decide the verdict. Was Lindsay Clancy legally responsible for her actions? Or was she suffering from a severe mental illness that prevented her from understanding what she was doing? In part 3, we examine why the defense questioned Patrick so carefully, what he revealed about Lindsay's mental health, and how those answers could become the foundation of one of the most closely watched insanity defenses in recent American history. After the jury heard the emotional 911 call, the defense changed the focus of the trial. The questions were no longer centered on what happened inside the Clancy home. Instead, they focused on Lindsay Clancy herself. What was her mental condition in the weeks before the tragedy? Was she thinking clearly? Or had her mind been overwhelmed by a severe psychiatric illness? Patrick Clancy remained on the witness stand, but now the defense began asking him about his wife's behavior long before January 24, 2023. Their questions were direct. How was Lindsay sleeping? How was she acting? Did she seem different? Patrick's answers painted a troubling picture. He testified that Lindsay was suffering from extreme sleep deprivation. She was constantly anxious. According to his testimony, there were times when he found her sitting on the couch, rocking back and forth with her knees pulled against her chest. The image immediately caught the attention of everyone in the courtroom. It suggested a woman who appeared deeply distressed long before the killings took place. Patrick also testified that he had become increasingly worried about her mental health. He described trying to support her, while doctors adjusted her medications in an effort to help her condition. These details were not introduced by accident. Every question served a legal purpose. The defense is not denying that Lindsay caused the deaths of her 3 children. Instead, they are arguing that she was suffering from postpartum psychosis, a rare but severe psychiatric disorder that can occur after childbirth. Unlike postpartum depression, postpartum psychosis is considered a medical emergency. In its most serious form, patients may experience hallucinations, delusions, severe confusion, or lose contact with reality. Mental health experts say that some patients genuinely believe they are protecting their children from imaginary dangers. Others may become convinced that voices or irrational beliefs are completely real. The defense argues that Lindsay's deteriorating condition had been building for weeks before the tragedy. They point to her insomnia, anxiety, frequent medication changes, psychiatric treatment, and increasingly unusual behavior as evidence that she was experiencing a profound mental health crisis. If the jury accepts that argument, the legal consequences could be dramatically different from a traditional murder conviction. But prosecutors see the evidence very differently. They argue that mental illness alone does not remove criminal responsibility. The key legal question is not whether Lindsay was mentally ill. The question is whether she was capable of understanding the nature and wrongfulness of her actions at the time the children were killed. To support their case, prosecutors have highlighted evidence they believe demonstrates planning and awareness. According to court testimony, Patrick left the house after Lindsay asked him to pick up takeout food. Prosecutors argued that this created a period of time during which she was alone with the children. They also point to the use of exercise bands, which investigators say were used in the killings. Their argument is straightforward. These actions require time, decisions, and purposeful behavior. From the prosecution's perspective, those facts are inconsistent with someone who had completely lost touch with reality. The defense strongly disagrees. They argue that people suffering from postpartum psychosis can still perform organized actions while experiencing severe delusions. According to their experts, outwardly purposeful behavior does not necessarily prove that a person understood the moral or legal consequences of those actions. This difference has become the heart of the trial. Both sides agree on what happened inside the house. What they disagree on is why it happened. Was this a deliberate act for which Lindsay Clancy should be held fully criminally responsible, or was it the tragic result of one of the most severe forms of postpartum mental illness? That is the question the jury must eventually answer. In Part 4, we will examine the prosecution's strongest evidence, the defense's final strategy, and why this verdict could become one of the most important legal decisions involving postpartum psychosis in the United States. As the trial moves closer to its conclusion, the jury faces one of the most difficult decisions any courtroom can demand. No one disputes that 3 innocent children lost their lives. No one disputes that Lindsay Clancy was the person responsible for their deaths. The only question that remains is one that has divided legal experts, psychiatrists, and the public for years. Should Lindsay Clancy be held fully criminally responsible, or was she suffering from a psychiatric illness so severe that she could no longer understand the nature or wrongfulness of her actions? For prosecutors, the answer is clear. They argue that the evidence demonstrates awareness and deliberate conduct. They point to the sequence of events presented during the trial. Patrick Clancy left the house after Lindsay asked him to pick up food. During that period, prosecutors say she was alone with the children. Investigators testified that exercise bands were used in the killings. Prosecutors argue that these acts require time, decision-making, and purposeful action. They also emphasize what Patrick discovered when he returned home. The blood throughout the bedroom, Lindsay's injuries after what prosecutors describe as an attempted suicide, and the heartbreaking 911 call that captured the immediate aftermath. Taken together, prosecutors believe these facts prove that Lindsay understood what she was doing and attempted to take her own life after the killings. The defense presents a completely different interpretation. They argue that organized behavior does not automatically prove legal sanity. According to psychiatric experts, patients experiencing postpartum psychosis may still appear calm or capable of completing complex actions while suffering from severe delusions or a complete break from reality. The defense reminds the jury that Lindsay had been receiving psychiatric treatment for weeks before the tragedy. Her medications had been adjusted several times. Patrick testified about her extreme anxiety, severe insomnia, and unusual behavior. The defense argues that these were not isolated symptoms. They were warning signs of a rapidly worsening mental illness. Ultimately, the jury must evaluate not only the physical evidence, but also the medical evidence. They will hear from expert witnesses on both sides. Psychiatrists are expected to offer sharply different opinions about Lindsay's mental condition at the time of the killings. Some experts may conclude that she understood exactly what she was doing. Others may testify that postpartum psychosis completely destroyed her ability to distinguish reality from delusion. The jury will be asked to weigh those opinions against every piece of evidence presented throughout the trial. This case has already become one of the most closely watched criminal trials involving postpartum mental illness in the United States. Whatever verdict is ultimately reached, legal experts believe it could influence how future courts evaluate similar defenses. For many families affected by severe postpartum psychiatric disorders, the outcome may also shape future conversations about diagnosis, treatment, and early intervention. As of today, the trial is still ongoing. No verdict has been reached. More witnesses are expected to testify, including additional medical experts whose opinions could become critical in determining the outcome of the case. The emotional 911 call may have left a lasting impression on the jury, but in the end, their decision cannot be based on emotion alone. It must be based on the law, the evidence, and one difficult question. Was Lindsay Clancy legally responsible for her actions on January 24, 2023? Or was this an unimaginable tragedy caused by a catastrophic mental illness? That answer now rests entirely in the hands of 12 jurors. As new testimony continues to emerge, this case remains far from over, and we will continue following every major development until the jury delivers its final verdict.